There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary. They were the camouflage of a Tuesday night, or the quiet hum of a refrigerator, and only in retrospect do you see them for what they were. The turning of a page, the laying of a cornerstone. For me, that moment felt like the weight of a human head in my lap, a profound and terrifying anchor in the shifting tides of my own quiet existence. It was Sam, of course. It was always Sam. He was asleep, his breathing a soft, rhythmic current against the fabric of my jeans, one arm draped loosely over his chest, the other hanging limply towards the floor. The blue-white light of the muted television flickered across his face, catching on the line of his jaw and the slight furrow between his brows, a small crease of worry that even sleep couldn't smooth away. In the stillness of our shared living room, with the city breathing a distant, mechanical sigh outside our window, I was a statue carved from indecision and a deep, aching tenderness that had lived in my bones for a decade. My entire world had contracted to this single point of contact. The warmth seeping through the denim, the subtle pressure of his skull against my thighs, the faint, clean scent of his shampoo, a mix of sandalwood and something vaguely citrusy that was so intrinsically him. My own breath was a prisoner in my lungs. I was terrified to move, to shift, to do anything that might break the spell and send him retreating back to his side of the couch, back to the carefully maintained space we always kept between us. This was a new and fragile geography we were navigating, and I was a cartographer with a trembling hand, terrified of drawing the map all wrong. For months, this had been our unspoken ritual, a slow, gravitational pull that ended here, in this configuration of exhausted trust and my own silent, screaming hope. And every single time, I would sit in the darkness and wonder if this was the night the pretense would finally shatter. I would wonder if I was building a bridge or just clinging to a cliff face, mistaking the fall for the act of flying. We met in the sterile, vaguely acrid air of a high school chemistry lab. It was a cliché, the kind of scene you'd skip over in a movie, but for me, it was the beginning of my own personal science, a long and patient study of a single, fascinating element, Samuel Chun. I was a quiet sophomore, more comfortable behind the lens of my camera than in the chaotic ecosystem of high school hallways. My world was a curated collection of still frames, of light and shadow, of moments captured and held still so I could understand them. People were largely a blur at the periphery, loud, fast, and unpredictable. I preferred the company of the darkroom, the patient alchemy of bringing an image to life in the shallow chemical bath. I was assigned a lab station by the window, and I was content with the idea of working alone, a solo observer in a room full of chattering pears. Then he arrived, a whirlwind of kinetic energy and easy confidence. Sam was a junior, one of the stars of the varsity soccer team, a person who moved through the school with an orbit of friends trailing in his wake. He was bright, not just in the academic sense, though he was that too, but in a way that seemed to generate its own light. He dropped his book bag onto the stool next to me, the sound echoing in my quiet bubble, and flashed a smile that was so disarmingly genuine it felt like a physical force. "Looks like we're partners," he'd said, his voice warm and devoid of the condescending coolness I expected from someone of his social standing. "I'm Sam. Try not to blow us up on the first day." I remembered just nodding, my own name a forgotten word on my tongue. I was intimidated, not by his popularity, but by his sheer, radiant presence. He was a son, and I had spent my life happily in the shade. Our partnership was an unlikely fusion. I was meticulous, organized, my lab notes a testament to precision and careful observation. I would measure reagents to the exact microliter, my hands steady, my focus absolute. Sam, for all his boisterous energy outside the lab, was surprisingly deferential to my process. He'd watch, leaning against the black countertop, his athletic frame a stark contrast to the delicate glassware, and he would listen. He'd ask questions, not to challenge, but to understand. "So why that indicator? What are we looking for? A color change? How do you know how much to add?" He had a quick, curious mind that was interested in the why of things, not just the answer that would get him an A. He'd handle the calculations, his pencil scratching quickly across his notebook, and I'd handle the delicate titration, the slow, careful dance of chemical reactions. We were a surprisingly efficient team. He was the theory, I was the practice. It was during one of those long afternoon labs, with sunlight slanting through the dusty windows and the low murmur of our classmates around us, that the foundation of my decade-long ache was laid. We were working on a crystallization experiment, waiting for a supersaturated solution to cool. Sam was talking about a recent soccer game, his hands moving as he described a particularly brilliant play, his eyes alight with the memory. I was pretending to watch the beaker, but all of my attention, every ounce of my observational skill, was focused on him. On the way a stray lock of dark hair fell across his forehead, on the crinkles that formed at the corners of his eyes when he laughed, on the casual way he existed in his own skin, so comfortable and unburdened. And in that moment, a feeling bloomed in my chest, something warm and terrifying and wholly unfamiliar. It was more than admiration. It was a deep, resonant pull, a feeling of recognition, as if a part of me that had been dormant had suddenly woken up and found its northern star. I was 16, and I had just discovered a force of nature more potent than any chemical reaction we could ever hope to induce in that lab. I quickly looked down at my notebook and scribbled a meaningless observation, my cheeks burning, my heart a frantic, trapped bird against my ribs. I buried it, of course. I buried it deep, under layers of pragmatism and self-preservation. He was Sam. He was popular, he was friendly to everyone, and he was, as far as the entire world was concerned, completely and utterly straight. He had a girlfriend, a cheerleader named Sarah who was as bright and sunny as he was. Seeing them together in the hallways was a specific kind of quiet pain, a confirmation of the unbridgeable distance between my world and his. So I learned to be a friend. It was a role I could play, a box I could fit my unwieldy feelings into. I became the quiet, steady presence in his life. The one he'd text with a complicated physics problem, the one he'd sit with at lunch when he wanted a break from the noise of his usual crowd. He seemed to value my quietness, my ability to just be there without demanding anything from him. For him, I was a port in a storm of social obligations. For me, he was the storm, and the port, and the sea all at once. My camera lens found him often, usually from a distance. Candid shots at soccer games, a stolen frame of him laughing in the quad. I told myself I was documenting school life. I was lying. I was building an archive of him. Our friendship, improbably, survived high school. We ended up at the same state university, not by design, but through a happy coincidence of scholarships and chosen majors. He was pre-med, still chasing the logic and certainty of science, and I had enrolled in the fine arts program. My camera now a permanent extension of my body. College expanded our world, but solidified our bond. We were a constant in each other's changing lives. His soccer stardom continued, and so did his string of bright, bubbly girlfriends. I had a few tentative, short-lived relationships of my own, quiet affairs that flickered and died out, never quite measuring up to the silent, towering edifice of my feelings for Sam. I never told him about them. I never told him about the guys I dated. It felt like a betrayal, not of him, but of the carefully constructed persona of the platonic best friend I had built. My life was compartmentalized. There was the part that was a friend to Sam, and there was the other part, the real part, that I kept locked away. He met Chloe during our junior year. She was different from the others. She was an architecture student, sharp and witty, with a dry sense of humor that seemed to challenge Sam in a way no one else had. She didn't just bask in his light. She had her own distinct, formidable glow. I liked her, which made it all the more painful. I saw how he looked at her, with a depth of seriousness that had been absent before. Their relationship wasn't a high school fling. It was a blueprint for a future. They talked about grad school in the same city, about apartments and shared lives. I watched them build their world, and I learned to be happy for him. I learned to be the supportive friend, to have dinner with them, to listen to Sam talk about their plans. Each time, it was like adding another lock to the door of that hidden room inside me. I became an expert in emotional containment. My photography grew more melancholic. more focused on empty spaces and the quiet poetry of absence. It was the only place my true feelings could breathe. After graduation, the idea of getting an apartment together felt like the most natural thing in the world. Chloe was starting a master's program in a different state, and they were going to try long distance. Sam had landed a high-pressure, high-paying job as a consultant for a tech firm downtown. I was piecing together a living with freelance photography gigs and a part-time job at a gallery. We were both starting new, uncertain chapters, and the idea of having a familiar anchor was appealing to both of us. "It'll be just like the dorms, but with a better kitchen and no RA," he'd said, clapping me on the shoulder. "And you can stop me from living entirely on takeout for me." The decision was both a lifeline and a form of self-inflicted torture. Living with him meant constant proximity, a daily, intimate look into the life I desperately wanted but could never have. But the alternative, not having him in my life at all, was unthinkable. It was a choice between a low, constant ache and a sharp, devastating amputation. I chose the ache. Our apartment was a small two-bedroom on the third floor of an old brick building. It had high ceilings, drafty windows, and hardwood floors that creaked with every step. My room was a cluttered sanctuary of camera equipment, photo books, and prints in various stages of development. Sam's room was minimalist and tidy, his life organized with the same precision he'd once applied to our lab notes. Our shared space was the living room, a neutral territory defined by a worn-out but comfortable couch, a coffee table perpetually covered in my books and his laptop, and a large window that looked out onto the branches of an old maple tree. For the first year, our lives ran on parallel tracks. He worked brutal hours, often coming home late, his face etched with a fatigue that his relentless optimism couldn't quite mask. He and Chloe were struggling with the distance, their phone calls becoming a source of tension I could feel radiating from his closed bedroom door. I would be in the living room, editing photos in the quiet glow of my laptop, and I would hear the low, frustrated murmur of his voice. I'd turn up the volume on my headphones, a gesture of respect for his privacy that was also an act of self-defense. I was his constant, the quiet roommate who was always there. I'd leave a plate of food for him in the microwave on nights he worked late. I'd make coffee in the morning before he was even awake. These were the small, permissible acts of caring that our friendship allowed. They were gestures of platonic affection, easily explained and easily accepted. But for me, each one was a coded message, a tiny, secret expression of the love I kept so carefully hidden. He was grateful, of course. "Leo, you're a lifesaver," he'd say, running a hand through his already messy hair. "I'd probably have scurvy by now if it weren't for you." He saw my actions as practical kindness. He never saw the devotion behind them, and that was the point. That was the shield that kept our friendship intact. I was the keeper of our equilibrium, the silent guardian of the status quo, because I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that the truth would wreck everything. The shift, when it came, was not a sudden earthquake, but a slow, grinding tectonic movement. It began with a phone call. I was in the kitchen, washing dishes, when Sam walked out of his room, his phone still in his hand. He looked pale, hollowed out. He didn't say anything. He just walked to the window and stared out at the maple tree, his shoulders slumped. The silence in the apartment was suddenly heavy, thick with a grief that wasn't mine but was impossible to ignore. After a long moment, he spoke, his voice quiet and rough. "Chloe and I broke up." It was a simple, declarative sentence, but it landed in the room like a physical object. I turned off the water, my hands still soapy, and just looked at him. There was nothing to say. "I'm sorry" felt hollow and inadequate. I had spent years quietly, shamefully wishing for this, and now that it was here, all I felt was a profound, aching sympathy for his pain. The end of their relationship wasn't a victory for my hidden love. It was the crumbling of a pillar in his life, and his sorrow was a palpable thing. He finally turned from the window, his eyes looking lost. "It's for the best, I guess," he mumbled, a line that sounded rehearsed and unconvincing. We were just building different things. The architectural metaphor, so close to her chosen profession, was unintentionally cruel. and I saw him flinch at his own words. He tried to smile, but it was a grimace, a painful twitch of his lips. Then he just nodded, as if to himself, and retreated back into his room, closing the door softly behind him. The click of the latch felt like a final, definitive sound. That was the first crack in the foundation of his carefully constructed world. The second came about a month later. His big consulting project, the one he had been pouring 80-hour weeks into, the one that was supposed to secure his promotion, was abruptly canceled. The client pulled out, the market shifted. The reasons were a blur of corporate jargon that Sam recited to me one night in a flat, emotionless voice. He'd pace the living room, run his hands through his hair, stare at his laptop without typing anything. The easy confidence that had been his defining characteristic since high school was gone, replaced by a raw, anxious vulnerability I had never seen in him. His orbit of friends, the ones from soccer and his old job, would call and text. "Want to grab a beer? Come out with us Friday night." He'd always say no. Not feeling it, he'd text back, before tossing his phone onto the couch with a sigh of frustration. He didn't want their pity, their well-meaning but useless advice. He was adrift, and he had retreated from the world that no longer seemed to have a place for him. And so he turned to me, not with words, but with proximity. He started spending more time in the shared spaces of our apartment, not just passing through, but settling. He'd bring his laptop into the living room while I was working, not to talk, but just to be in the same room. He'd sit on the far end of the couch, the familiar, safe distance between us, and we would exist together in a comfortable silence, the clicking of our keyboards the only conversation. I didn't push. I didn't pry. I just let him be. I continued to make coffee, to leave food for him. My small acts of care, once just a quiet background hum, became the only stable structure in his collapsing world. I was the one thing that hadn't changed. I was still Leo, his quiet, steady friend. The keeper of the equilibrium. That was how the ritual began. It started innocently enough. We were watching a movie, a mindless action flick he'd put on to fill the silence. He was sitting on his end of the couch, I was on mine. About halfway through, he shifted, then leaned over and rested his head on my shoulder. My entire body went rigid. It was a casual, friendly gesture, the kind friends made all the time. But it was not the kind of friends we were. We had a language of space, of carefully observed boundaries, and he had just crossed a significant one. I could feel the warmth of his cheek against the cotton of my t-shirt. I could smell that sandalwood shampoo, a scent that felt impossibly intimate. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. I stared at the screen, not seeing the explosions or the car chases, my entire consciousness focused on the point of contact. After a few minutes, he let out a soft sigh, his body seeming to relax more fully against me. "Sorry," he mumbled, his voice thick with sleep. Long day. He didn't move away. He stayed there, his breathing evening out, until the credits rolled. When the movie ended, he stirred, sat up, and scrubbed a hand over his face. "Thanks," he said, as if I had done him a service. "I should probably go to bed." He disappeared into his room, and I sat there in the flickering blue light, my shoulder tingling, my heart hammering against my ribs. I spent hours dissecting that moment. I replayed it in my mind, analyzing it from every angle, like a photograph I was trying to develop. The logical part of my brain, the part that had kept me safe for a decade, told me it meant nothing. He was exhausted, emotionally drained, and grieving. He was seeking simple, uncomplicated physical comfort, the kind a child might seek from a parent. It was a gesture born of need, not affection. It was platonic. It had to be. But the other part of me, the hopeful, foolish part one kept locked away, saw it as a sign. A crack in the wall he kept around himself. A silent admission that he needed me, not just anyone, but me. I felt a dangerous, terrifying hope begin to germinate in the dark, cultivated soil of my heart. I told myself to be careful, to not read into it, to not build a fantasy on such a fragile foundation. A few nights later, it happened again. Another movie, another long, quiet day. This time, there was less hesitation. He just shifted, leaned, and settled his head against my shoulder as if it were the most natural thing in the world. I was more prepared this time. I managed to keep my breathing even, to not tense up. I tried to accept it for what it was, a new clause in the contract of our friendship. This is what he needed from me now. Comfort. Stability. A quiet place to rest his head. I could provide that. I could be that for him. The movie played on, and I sat there, a living statue, providing silent support. It was both exquisite torture and the most profound sense of peace I had ever known. I was useful to him in a way that felt more meaningful than fixing his laptop or making him dinner. I was a human anchor, and I was terrified of how much I loved the feeling of his weight against me. The ritual evolved. The shoulder became the first step. A week or so after that, we were on the couch again. It was late, and I was reading, the soft glow of a lamp creating a small pool of light in the dark room. He came out of his room, looking wrecked. He'd spent the day on a series of fruitless job interviews, each one chipping away at his remaining confidence. He sat on the couch, not even bothering to turn on the TV. He just stared into the middle distance. After a few minutes of heavy silence, he sighed, a sound of utter defeat, and then he moved. He didn't lean on my shoulder. He laid down, stretching his long frame out on the couch, and without a word, without even looking at me, he placed his head in my lap. Time stopped. My book lay forgotten in my hands. The world narrowed to the feeling of his hair against my jeans, the warmth of him, the sheer, shocking intimacy of the act. My lap, of all the places. It wasn't a friendly, casual gesture like a head on a shoulder. This was different. This was an act of profound surrender. He had made himself completely vulnerable, placing himself in a position of utter trust. My hands were frozen, hovering in the air above him. Did I touch him? Did I run my fingers through his hair, a gesture my entire being was screaming at me to make? Or did I remain perfectly still, a passive, inanimate object of comfort? The fear of misinterpretation, of crossing a line he hadn't intended to draw, was paralyzing. I chose stillness. I became a piece of furniture, a living pillow, my heart a frantic drum against the silence. He fell asleep within minutes. His breathing deepened, the tense lines of his face softened, and the crease between his brows finally smoothed out. He looked younger, more peaceful than I had seen him in months. And I sat there, for what must have been 2 hours, my legs cramping, my back aching, afraid to move a single muscle. I watched the slow rise and fall of his chest. I studied the curve of his eyelashes against his cheek. I drank in the sight of him, this impossible, beautiful boy who had taken up residence in the center of my world, now physically resting in the center of my lap. It was a moment of such intense, painful beauty. It was everything I had ever wanted and a stark reminder of everything I couldn't have. He was seeking comfort, not me. He was seeking an escape from his own lonely, anxious thoughts, and I was just a convenient, warm body. I had to remember that. It was the only way to survive it. This became the new normal. 2 or 3 nights a week, our evenings would end this way. We'd coexist in the living room, in our separate silences, and then, like a tide coming in, he would shift, move, and settle. The couch, once a piece of neutral furniture, became a stage for this silent, intimate play. My anxiety never fully went away, but it was joined by a sense of accustomed wonder. I learned the rhythm of his sleep, the way he would sometimes murmur incomprehensible words, the way he would unconsciously shift closer to my warmth. And I learned to allow myself one small, secret transgression. After he was deeply asleep, when I was sure he wouldn't stir, I would slowly, hesitantly, rest my hand on his hair. It was the softest thing I had ever touched. I would just leave it there, my palm cupping the back of his head, my fingers gently threaded through the dark strands. It was a stolen intimacy, a secret I kept in the dead of night. I was a thief, stealing moments of affection he would never know he had given. I told myself it was harmless. It was a comfort to me, and he was none the wiser. But I knew it was a dangerous game. I was blurring the lines in my own mind, letting hope grow in a place where it had no right to be. The plausible deniability of it all was the real killer. It was the architecture that allowed this whole fragile structure to exist. He was tired. He was stressed. The couch was long, and I was sitting at one end. It was simply the most logical configuration for a nap. Any other interpretation was a projection of my own feelings. I knew this. I would repeat it to myself like a mantra. He's just tired. It doesn't mean anything. But his actions began to betray that logic. He started leaving the door to his bedroom slightly ajar at night. Not wide open, but cracked just enough that a sliver of light from the hallway could get in. It was a small change, but in the hyper-vigilant state of my observational analysis, it was monumental. It felt like an invitation, a lowering of a barrier. He, who had once needed the definitive click of a latch to seal himself off, was now leaving an opening. Was he lonely? Was he afraid of the dark, in a metaphorical sense? Or was he, in some subconscious way, leaving a path open for me? The question haunted me. I never crossed the threshold. I would see that sliver of light as I passed on my way to my own room, and my heart would ache with a universe of unspoken possibilities. I lived for those evenings on the couch. My own life, my photography, my friends, all of it became a preamble to the night. I would find myself rushing through my work, declining invitations to go out, just to ensure I was home, that I was available to be his anchor if he needed one. My entire existence had been reoriented around his need for comfort. I was a planet caught in the gravitational pull of a dying star, my own orbit decaying until I was just circling, waiting. Some nights, he would be in a better mood. He'd get a promising lead on a job, or have a good conversation with a recruiter. On those nights, he would keep his distance. He'd be more like the old Sam, energetic and optimistic, talking about his plans, and he'd go to his own bed at a reasonable hour, closing his door firmly behind him. I should have been happy for him, and a part of me was. But a larger, more selfish part of me felt a pang of disappointment. On those nights, the living room felt vast and empty, the couch a lonely expanse of faded fabric. I missed the weight of him. I missed the quiet intimacy of our ritual, and I hated myself for it. I hated that I was beginning to find comfort in his sadness, because his sadness brought him closer to me. One night, the tension that had been building for months finally found its breaking point. It had been a particularly bad day for him. A final round interview for a job he really wanted had ended in a polite, generic rejection email. He had been silent all evening, a thundercloud of disappointment and self-recrimination hovering in the air around him. When he finally laid down on the couch, his head in my lap, there was a feeling of desperate finality to it. He didn't just seem tired. He seemed broken. He turned his face inward, pressing it against my stomach, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. I could feel the rigid tension in his whole body. He wasn't falling asleep. He was hiding. I did something I had never done before. I broke the rule of stillness. I slowly, deliberately, brought my hand to his head and began to run my fingers through his hair. He didn't flinch. He didn't pull away. Instead, a long, shuddering breath escaped him, and I felt his body go limp, the tension releasing in a single, sorrowful wave. He melted into me, a subtle shift from just resting on me to actively seeking refuge in my touch. I continued the motion, a slow, rhythmic carting of my fingers from his temple to the nape of his neck. It was a silent conversation. "I'm here. It's okay. I've got you." The air in the room was thick, charged with everything we had never said. The hum of the refrigerator seemed deafening. I could feel my own heartbeat in my throat, a frantic, pulsing rhythm. After a long time, maybe 10 minutes, maybe an hour, he shifted again. He didn't lift his head, but he tilted it back, looking up at me. His eyes, in the dim light from the lamp, were dark and deep and full of a raw, unguarded emotion I had never seen before. The pretense was gone. The exhaustion, the plausible deniability, it all evaporated in that single, searching look. He wasn't just a tired friend seeking comfort. He was Sam, looking at me, Leo, and the space between us was suddenly charged with a new, terrifying, and beautiful electricity. The silence stretched, and I felt as if the entire world was holding its breath, waiting. "Leo." His voice was a whisper, rough and fragile. I couldn't speak. I just looked down at him, my hand still resting in his hair, my heart feeling like it was about to beat its way out of my chest. I gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. He swallowed, his gaze never leaving mine. "Can I ask you something weird?" Another nod. My throat was too tight for words. This was it. This was the moment the map was either finished or torn to pieces. The culmination of a decade of silent observation, of unspoken affection. Everything was balanced on the head of a pin, and I was terrified of the fall, but the thought of flying was so overwhelmingly seductive. He took a shallow breath, and the vulnerability in his eyes was so profound it made my own eyes burn. "Would it be okay?" he whispered, the words hanging in the air between us, precious and terrifying. "If I kissed you?" The question was not an act of aggression or seduction. It was a plea. It was a confession. It was him, handing me all of his confusion and fear and nascent, unexamined desire, and asking me what to do with it. He was giving me the power, the choice. He was asking for permission to shatter the world we had so carefully built. In that moment, all my fear, all my years of self-preservation, they didn't matter. All that mattered was the beautiful, broken boy looking up at me, offering me the one thing I had never, ever allowed myself to hope for. I couldn't find my voice, so I just nodded, a single, decisive dip of my chin. "Yes." He rose slowly, pushing himself up onto his elbows. He never broke eye contact. The movement was tentative, hesitant, as if he was expecting me to bolt at any second. He leaned in, and I met him halfway, tilting my head down. The first touch of his lips to mine was impossibly soft. It wasn't a kiss of passion or demand. It was a question, a confirmation. It was feather-light, a gentle pressure, a shared breath. It tasted of salt, and I realized with a jolt that he had been silently crying. The kiss lasted only a few seconds, but it contained the entire history of our friendship, all the unspoken words, all the stolen glances, all the quiet, aching years. It was a moment of perfect, terrifying clarity. Then, just as gently as it began, it was over. He pulled back, his eyes wide, a look of dawning horror on his face. The connection was broken, and the air rushed back into the vacuum, cold and sharp. He stared at me for a second, his expression a chaotic mix of shock, fear, and something that looked like regret. I'm sorry," he stammered, the words clumsy and sharp. He scrambled off the couch, moving with a panicked urgency, putting as much distance between us as possible. "I shouldn't have. I'm sorry." He didn't wait for a response. He turned and practically fled to his room, and this time, the click of his door closing was not soft. It was a slam, a final, definitive sound that echoed the slam of a vault door on my own heart. I sat there, alone on the couch, my lips still tingling from the ghost of his. The warmth where his head had been was already fading. The room was silent, but my mind was screaming. I had been so wrong. I had misread everything. The rituals, the touches, the open door. I had built a cathedral of hope on a foundation of sand, and the tide had just come in and washed it all away. He hadn't been confessing his feelings. He had been having a moment of desperate, confused weakness. He had crossed a line, and his immediate regret was a brutal confirmation of my foolishness. The kiss hadn't been a beginning. It had been a mistake. His mistake. And I had let him make it. I had nodded. I had said yes. The days that followed were the worst of my life. The silence in our apartment was no longer comfortable. It was a weapon. It was a thick, suffocating blanket of awkwardness and regret. We became ghosts to each other again, but this time it was different. Before, we were on parallel tracks. Now, we were on opposite sides of a chasm that had opened up on our living room floor. He avoided me with a painful, deliberate precision. If I was in the kitchen, he stayed in his room. If he heard me coming down the hall, he would duck into the bathroom. We communicated through the absence of sound. The apartment, once my sanctuary, felt like a prison. The couch was a monument to my humiliation. I couldn't even look at it. I replayed his apology over and over in my head. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have." The words were acid. He was sorry he had kissed me. He regretted it. The vulnerability I had seen in his eyes, I had misinterpreted it as desire. It was just desperation. He had reached for the closest source of comfort in a moment of crisis and had recoiled in horror at what he had done. And I, the quiet observer, the one who was supposed to be so perceptive, had seen only what I wanted to see. The pain was a physical thing, a dull, constant ache in my chest that made it hard to breathe. It wasn't just the loss of a potential future. It was the acute, agonizing loss of the past. Our friendship, the one thing I had guarded so fiercely for a decade, felt like it was shattered beyond repair. How could we go back? How could we sit on that couch again, pretending that kiss, that question, had never happened? He started leaving the apartment. He'd go out for long runs, returning hours later, flushed and exhausted, and disappear straight into the shower. He started seeing his friends again. I'd hear him on the phone, forcing a cheerful tone. "Yeah, Friday sounds good. Where are we meeting?" He was trying to rebuild his old life, the one that had existed before Chloe left, before he lost his job, before he had made the catastrophic error of kissing his roommate. He was trying to erase the last few months, and by extension, he was trying to erase me. Each time he left, closing the front door behind him, it felt like a small abandonment. He was running away from what happened, and he was running away from me. The sliver of light under his bedroom door was gone. It was now sealed tight, a fortress against any further intimacy. I tried to retreat into my own world. I threw myself into my photography. I took long walks through the city, my camera in hand. But the world seemed gray and muted. My eye, usually so keen to find beauty in the overlooked corners of the world, saw only loneliness. I photographed empty park benches, single shoes abandoned on the sidewalk, windows with the curtains drawn. My work was a direct reflection of the hollow space in my chest. I was grieving, not just for Sam, but for the version of myself who had dared to hope. That version felt naive and foolish, and I wanted to bury him just as deep as I had once buried my feelings. After a week of this agonizing, silent Cold War, I knew something had to break. I couldn't live like this. The ache of his absence when he was in the very next room was worse than any distance. It was a haunting. I was being haunted by the ghost of our friendship. I was angry, too. A slow-burning anger was starting to replace the sharp edges of the hurt. I was angry at him for his cowardice, for running away instead of talking to me. But mostly, I was angry at myself for letting the silence fester, for allowing him to define the narrative of what had happened. It wasn't just his mistake. I was there. I had nodded. I had wanted it. He didn't get to be the only one whose feelings mattered. That night, I saw the light on under his door. I heard the low murmur of the television. He was in there, hiding, just like he had been for a week. I stood in the hallway for a long time, my heart pounding, my hands clammy. I was terrified. What if I made it worse? What if this was the conversation that finally ended it all, that led to one of us moving out? But the thought of continuing on as we were was more terrifying. I took a deep breath, walked to his door, and knocked. The sound was unnaturally loud in the silent apartment. The TV sound cut off abruptly. There was a long pause. "Yeah." His voice was muffled, cautious. "Can I come in?" I asked, my own voice steadier than I expected. Another pause. I could hear him moving, the creak of his bed. Then footsteps. The door opened a few inches. He stood there, blocking the entrance, looking exhausted and wary. He wasn't meeting my eyes. "It's late, Leo," he said, his voice low. "I don't care," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "We can't keep doing this, Sam. This." Silence. "It's not working." He still wouldn't look at me, his gaze fixed on a spot on the floor somewhere to my left. "You don't get to just run away," I continued. "You don't get to kiss me and then pretend I don't exist." That got his attention. He finally looked at me, and his eyes were filled with a misery that was so profound it almost buckled my knees. "Leo, I said I was sorry," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I know," I said, my anger softening as I saw the depth of his pain. "But you were sorry for the wrong thing. You acted like you were the only one there. Like it was something you did to me. It wasn't. I was there too. And I wasn't sorry." The words hung in the air, a confession I had never planned to make. But it was the truth, and the truth was all I had left. He finally sagged, his shoulders slumping in defeat. He opened the door wider and stepped back, a silent invitation to enter. His room was dark, save for the glow of the paused TV. Clothes were piled on a chair. His desk was a mess of papers, and empty coffee mugs. It was the room of a person who had given up. He sat on the edge of his bed, his head in his hands. I closed the door behind me and leaned against it, giving him space. "I don't know what's wrong with me," he said, his voice muffled by his hands. "I've been so lost. Everything just fell apart, you know? Chloe, the job. Everything I thought I was, it's just gone. And you were the only thing that felt real. The only thing that was still solid." He looked up at me, his face a mask of confusion and despair. "Being on that couch, with you. It was the only time my brain would shut up. The only time I felt safe." "So what was the kiss, Sam?" I asked quietly, needing to hear it, needing to understand. Was it just another way to feel safe? He shook his head, a frustrated, angry motion. "No, I don't know. Yes, at first, maybe. But then, it wasn't. That night, looking at you. He trailed off, unable to find the words. He stood up and started pacing the small space between his bed and the desk, a caged animal. "I've spent my whole life on a track, Leo. High school, soccer, college, pre-med, consulting. It was all laid out. This is what you do. This is who you are. This is who you date. It was all so simple. And then the track disappeared. And I was just falling." He stopped pacing and looked at me, his eyes pleading. "And you were there. You've always been there. Quiet and steady, and you see me. I don't know how else to explain it. You see me. Chloe didn't, not really. My parents don't. My friends don't. But you do. And that night, I wanted to be seen. And I wanted to kiss you. I really wanted to kiss you." He said the words like a confession of a crime, his voice low and full of shame. "And then I did. And it felt right. For a second, it felt so incredibly right. And that terrified me more than anything else." "Why?" I whispered. "Why did it terrify you?" "Because it's not the track," he burst out, his voice cracking with emotion. "It's not part of the plan. It doesn't make any sense. I've never." He couldn't even say the words. He couldn't label himself. He just gestured helplessly between us. "What does this even mean? What am I supposed to do with this feeling? I've already lost everything, Leo. I can't lose you too. You're my best friend. And I thought I had ruined it. That I had made you uncomfortable. That I had destroyed the one good thing I had left." And there it was. His fear wasn't about me, or about the kiss itself. It was about the destruction of our friendship, the same fear that I had lived with for 10 years. He had retreated not because he regretted the kiss, but because he was terrified of its implications, terrified of losing me. The anger I had been holding on to dissolved completely, replaced by a wave of overwhelming empathy. He wasn't a coward. He was just as scared as I was. I pushed off the door and walked slowly towards him. I stopped in front of him, close enough to feel the heat radiating from his body. "You didn't ruin it," I said, my voice soft. "You just broke it open. Maybe it needed to be broken. That thing we had, that careful friendship. It wasn't entirely honest, was it? Not for me. Anyway." I took a breath, the final confession feeling like a leap into the void. "I've been in love with you since we were 16, Sam." He stared at me, his mouth slightly open. The frantic energy drained out of him, replaced by a stunned stillness. "What?" he breathed. "In the chemistry lab," I said, a small, sad smile on my lips. "You were talking about soccer. And I knew. I've spent the last 10 years being your friend, and it was the best and hardest thing I've ever done. So when you ask if you ruined it, you have to understand. For me, there was always something more to ruin." I let the words settle in the quiet room. I had laid all my cards on the table. There were no more secrets, no more hidden rooms. Just the raw, honest truth. He just looked at me, his eyes searching my face, recontextualizing a decade of our shared history in a matter of seconds. I could see the moments flickering in his eyes, the late-night study sessions, the meals I'd left for him, the quiet companionship. He was finally seeing the devotion behind the practicality. After a long, silent moment, he closed the small distance between us and wrapped his arms around me, burying his face in my shoulder. His body was shaking with silent sobs. It wasn't the desperate, seeking refuge hold from the couch. This was different. This was a homecoming. I wrapped my arms around him, holding him tightly, my own eyes burning. We just stood there, in the middle of his messy room, holding on to each other, two people who had finally stopped running. We didn't talk much more that night. Words felt clumsy and insufficient after everything that had been said. After a while, he just led me to his bed, and we laid down on top of the covers, still fully clothed. He curled up against me, his head on my chest, his arm draped over my waist. It was a mirror of our couch ritual, but all the ambiguity was gone. This was not about plausible deniability. This was intentional. I rested my cheek on the top of his head, breathing in the scent of his hair, and for the first time, I felt no anxiety, no fear of misinterpretation. There was only a profound, quiet peace. We fell asleep like that, in the wreckage of our old friendship, on the foundation of something new and terrifying and beautiful. The next morning, I woke up first. The sun was streaming through his window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Sam was still asleep, his face peaceful, his arms still possessively around my waist. I lay there, watching him, feeling a sense of quiet wonder. This was real. This was happening. He stirred, his eyes fluttering open. He looked at me, and for a second, I saw a flicker of the old panic. But then it was gone, replaced by a soft, tentative smile. "Morning," he mumbled, his voice thick with sleep. "Morning," I smiled back. There was a moment of quiet uncertainty, a what now, hanging in the air. He solved it by leaning in and kissing me, a simple, soft, morning kiss. It was gentle and sure, a statement, not a question. "I'm still scared," he admitted quietly, pulling back. "I still don't know what this all means, me too," I said, and it was the truth. "But we don't have to figure it all out today. We can just start here," and that's what we did. We started there. The days that followed were a slow, careful process of learning a new language. A new language of touch, of looks, of shared space. It was tentative and sometimes awkward. We were rebuilding from the ground up. The first time I took his hand as we walked down the street, I felt his initial hesitation, and then the way his fingers tightened around mine, a silent confirmation. We learned how to be together in public, a small, private bubble in the bustling city. The first time he introduced me to one of his friends, he just said, "This is Leo." But there was a new weight to the name, a new possessiveness in his arm around my shoulders that the friend noticed. He just smiled and said, "It's good to finally meet you, man. I've heard a lot about you." Sam's fear of the world's judgment was, it turned out, larger in his mind than in reality. We reclaimed the couch. A few nights after our conversation, we were in the living room, the TV on, the old familiar setting. I was sitting on my end, he was on his. The old habit of distance was a hard one to break. After a while, he looked at me, a small, shy smile on his face. He patted his lap. "You look uncomfortable all the way over there," he said, his voice playful. I laughed, a real, genuine laugh, and went to him, settling down, resting my head in his lap this time. He immediately started running his fingers through my hair, the gesture that had once been my own secret transgression, now an open, shared act of affection. The ritual was no longer a source of anxiety and hope. It was just a source of comfort. It was ours now, fully and honestly. His bedroom door was never just ajar again. Most nights, it was wide open, an invitation. More often than not, we ended up behind the same closed door, in his bed or mine. The intimacy of sharing that space, of sleeping and waking together, was a quiet revelation. It wasn't about passion, not at first. It was about proximity, about the simple, profound comfort of having another person there in the dark. It was about the end of loneliness. I learned the landscape of his sleeping form, the way he'd steal the covers, the way he'd reach for me in the middle of the night, a subconscious, instinctual act of connection. I started taking pictures of him again. Not stolen shots from a distance, but portraits. I'd catch him in the morning, sunlight streaming through the window, his hair a mess, a sleepy smile on his face. I photographed his hands as he made coffee, the focused line of his brow as he read a book, the way he laughed, throwing his head back. My photography, once a study of absence, became a celebration of presence. I was no longer just an observer of his life. I was a part of it. And he, the unknowing initiator, the boy who had stumbled into intimacy out of need, was learning to initiate it out of love. He was learning that his feelings for me weren't a deviation from the track. They were the destination he had been looking for all along. We began to heal, both separately and together. He found a new job, one that he was passionate about, at a smaller company with a better culture. His confidence returned, but it was different now. It was quieter, more self-assured, less dependent on external validation. He didn't need a predefined track anymore. He was learning to draw his own map. And I, the quiet observer, was learning to step out from behind the lens. I was learning to live in the moments, not just capture them. I was learning that vulnerability was not a weakness, but a bridge. It's a strange and beautiful alchemy, the process of two people finding a home in one another. It doesn't happen with a single kiss or a dramatic confession. It happens in the quiet moments, in the shared silence of a morning coffee, in the gentle weight of a head in a lap, in the simple, profound peace of knowing you are finally, truly seen. We had spent a decade in a carefully constructed room of friendship, with a door that I had kept locked out of fear. He, in his own confused, desperate way, had been the one to finally knock it down. And in the beautiful, honest silence of the wreckage, we learned how to build a home.